Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the 23rd Annual Sterling McMurrin Lecture on Religion and Culture. My name is Bob Goldberg. I'm a professor of history and director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones, your pagers, and all things, any things that might beep in the night. Sterling McMurrin died in 1996. He left a profound legacy of scholarship and service. Professor McMurrin taught in both the philosophy and history departments. He served the university as Dean of the College of Letters and Science, Dean of the Graduate School, Academic Vice President, and Provost. Sterling McMurrin also held the post of United States Commissioner of Education under President John F. Kennedy. In his name, the McMurrin Lecture on Religion and Culture has been established. The goal is to provide the best scholarship on religion to our students, faculty, and Utah community. Previous McMurrin lecturers have included Krista Tippett, Reza Aslan, Thupten Jimpa, Kathleen Flake, and Laurel Thatchell Ulrich. To introduce this year's McMurrin lecturer, please welcome Paul Reeve, Professor of History at the University of Utah.
Thank you. David Campbell is Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame and founding director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy. His most recent book, Seeking the Promised Land, Mormons and American Politics, with John Green and Quinn Monson, was published by Cambridge University Press this year. He is also the co-author with Robert Putnam of American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, which has been described by the New York Times as intellectually powerful, by America as an instant classic, and by the San Francisco Chronicle as the most successful argued sociological study of American religion in more than half a century. American Grace has also received both the 2011 Woodrow Wilson Award from the American Political Science Association for the best book on government, politics, or international affairs, and the Wilbur Award from the Religious Communicators Council for the best nonfiction book of 2010. Professor Campbell is also the author of Why We Vote, How Schools and Communities Shape Our Civic Life, the editor of A Matter of Faith, Religion in the 2004 Presidential Election, and co-editor of Making Civics Count, Citizenship Education for a New Generation. As an expert on religion, politics, and civic engagement, he has been featured in the national media, including the New York Times, Economist, USA Today, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Time, NBC News, CNN, NPR, Fox News, and C-SPAN. The title of his lecture tonight is Whither, the Promised Land, Mormons' Place in a Changing Religious Landscape. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Campbell to Utah.
Wow, after that introduction, some of you were wondering, are we actually going to hear a lecture tonight or just going to hear some introductions? But you know, one thing that was missed in the introduction is a little bit of personal background on me. So you might be interested in knowing that I am the father of two and the husband of one, which is a line that always gets a bigger laugh in Utah than anywhere else in the Union. So I am grateful to be here tonight, and I thank the Tanner Center for their generosity in sponsoring my visit here. Thank you to Bob Goldberg and to Paul for those warm words of introduction. And I'm humbled to deliver a lecture named for someone with such a formidable intellect as Sterling McMurrin, especially since I've been surrounded today by historians and philosophers, people who actually know stuff. I'm merely a social scientist, so I hope that I can do justice to the Sterling McMurrin lecture tonight. This is what in politics is known as lowering expectations. You want to manage expectations. So. In 1996, Time magazine named Stephen R. Covey one of the 25 most influential Americans. His best-known book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has long been a staple of bookstores and bestseller lists, having sold over 25 million copies. Covey, as I'm sure many in the room know, built an empire on his philosophy of self-help, teaching regular folk and business leaders how to lead effective and successful lives. And when he passed away in 2012, while my co-authors and I were writing this book, his New York Times obituary noted that more than 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies had sought his advice. Covey also consulted with political leaders from both sides of the political aisle. He won praise from Democrats like Bill Clinton and Republicans like Newt Gingrich. With his bipartisan appeal, folksy wisdom, and sunny disposition, Stephen R. Covey was part Norman Vincent Peale and part Dale Carnegie. And Stephen R. Covey was also a Mormon. And far from being merely a peripheral aspect of his life and work, Covey's Mormonism served as the foundation of his famous 7 habits. Fellow Mormon and Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen told The Economist magazine that, quote, "The 7 habits are essentially a secular distillation of Mormon teaching." Stephen R. Covey is a prime example of how Americans are in one sense quintessential, or how Mormons are in one sense the quintessential Americans, as George Will once put it. But I'd like to contrast Stephen R. Covey with Mitt Romney. Remember him? Given that religion is pretty important in America, it comes up a lot in our politics, you might think that belonging to the quintessentially American church, as Mitt Romney does, would be a political asset, especially in the Republican primaries, where conservative values are a positive. Right? This is the way you attract Republican voters. But instead, back in 2008, when Romney was first running for the presidency, he was confronted with suspicion regarding his religion from both the left and the right. The left-leaning New Republic magazine actually ran a cover story about apprehensions regarding a Mormon president, the author arguing that such concern over a Mormon president was thoroughly justified. While online, the magazine Slate published a column in which Jacob Weisberg wrote that, quote, he would not vote for someone who truly believed in the founding whoppers of Mormonism. From the political right, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, and fellow contender for the 2008 nomination in the GOP, took a subtle jab, or maybe a not-so-subtle jab, at Romney by remarking to a New York Times reporter that isn't it true that Mormons believe that Jesus and Satan are brothers? Just saying, Huckabee said. And out on the hustings, the anti-Mormon sentiment that Romney faced was anything but subtle. In South Carolina, just before the primary there, voters were sent an unsigned 8-page anti-Mormon diatribe focused on a particular candidate who happened to be running in that primary. And it was in that context at that time that the Gallup poll found that roughly 30% of Americans openly said that they would not vote for a Mormon for president, a number that was essentially unchanged since 1967 when Mitt's father, George Romney, was a contender for the Republican presidential nomination. Interestingly, that's about the same percentage of Americans who also told Gallup back in 1960 that they would not vote for a Catholic candidate for the presidency. Now, I'll have more to say about Mitt Romney a little later in my remarks tonight, but for now, let me underscore that the public reaction to Romney's Mormonism highlights that Mormons have not yet found their promised land. That is full acceptance within the American religious mosaic, like, say, Catholics or Jews have. And so Covey, his life and his story shows us the good news about Mormonism, the quintessential Americanness, whereas at least the first part of Romney's story suggests the bad news, that perhaps Mormons have not met with full acceptance yet within that religious mosaic here in the nation. And so today in my talk, I'm going to talk about that good news and that bad news. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Mormons are distinctive, a peculiar people. Then I'm going to talk about the internal consequences of that distinctiveness, what it means inside the faith. And then I will talk about the external consequences of that distinctiveness, what it means outside of Mormonism, that is, how non-Mormons perceive Mormons. But let me begin with the point that Mormons truly are distinctive. When it comes to their religious behavior, these are activities where we can compare what Mormons do to what members of other religious groups do. No other religious group in the United States today displays the same level of religious commitment as do Mormons. No group attends religious services more frequently. No group, on average, gives more money to their church than do Latter-day Saints. And no group comes anywhere close to the amount of time that Mormons volunteer in their faith. And when it comes to their theology, Mormons are distinctive. Not only in the things that they believe, but also in the incredibly high percentage of Mormons who fully endorse those distinctive theological beliefs. Just to give you some examples. In national surveys of Mormons that my co-authors and I have done and that have been done by the Pew Research Center, we find that 95% of self-identified Mormons believe that families can be bound together eternally through temple rites. 94% believe that God and Christ are separate physical beings. 96% believe that the Book of Mormon is a record of real people and real events. And, especially important for understanding Mormons' political activity, 94% believe that the president of the LDS Church is a prophet of God. Now, to many of you in the audience, you're thinking, well, what's remarkable about that? Those are the things Mormons are supposed to believe. But I assure you, as a professor at a certain Catholic university in Indiana, that at least when it comes to American Catholics, and especially American Catholic college students, I do not find the same sort of widespread endorsement of the fundamental tenets of Catholicism. And when we look in the survey data, it is also true that, let's just say, Americans are often quite selective in the theology they choose to embrace in their various faiths. So Mormons stand apart, not only in what they believe on the books, but what the rank and file membership actually at least tell us they subscribe to. But Mormons are also distinctive in the social networks that they form. To introduce two highfalutin social sciencey terms, Mormons are very high on measures of homophily and endogamy, which means that Mormons like to hang out with other Mormons. Birds of a feather truly do flock together. And Mormons are more likely than any other religious group in America to marry co-religionists, to marry fellow Mormons. The only group, or two groups, that are comparable to Mormons when it comes to these measures of togetherness are Black Protestants and Latino Catholics. And I emphasize that it's African American Protestants and Hispanic Catholics who come close to Mormons, because those are two religious groups that are defined just as much by their ethnicity as they are by their religion, which only underscores that Mormons are a quasi-ethnic group. We can't go quite so far as to say they're truly an ethnic group, but they certainly have many of the characteristics of an ethnicity. And one of the ways that we see this is in a measure of identity. Now, identity is one of these fancy $5 terms that social scientists use that really just means how people perceive themselves. And so my co-authors and I, in a big national survey of Mormons, scientifically drawn, so it's representative of the national population of Mormons, we took an index of identity that is typically used to measure how groups that we would identify as ethnic or racial, say African Americans or Latinos. We took an index that was used to measure the we-ness, the sense of identity found in groups like that, and we wanted to see how Mormons scored when we asked them the same sorts of questions. These are questions like, I won't read them all, but a few of them are. When I talk about Mormons, I usually say we rather than they. Or, being a Mormon is an essential part of who I am. Or, when someone criticizes Mormons, it feels like a personal insult. Now, the slide that I'm showing you here, and I want to reassure you that tonight's presentation will not be death by PowerPoint. I will use slides sparingly. Some people are visual learners and they like the pictures, and some of you, the last thing you want to do is look at charts and graphs. And if you're one of those people, that's fine. You can close your eyes. I'll describe it fully, and you don't have to look at the picture at all. But for those who like the pictures, this shows you how Mormons in America score on all of our measures of Mormon identity. And on every single one of them, we see staggeringly high percentages of Mormons endorsing that when they talk about Mormons, they say we, not I. Insults to Mormons are considered an insult to them, and all the rest. In other words, Mormons have a very strong sense of identity, which suggests that they are very much like an ethnic group because they're distinctive. And that distinctiveness comes with, as I'll emphasize again and again tonight, both good news and bad news. So for Mormons, here's perhaps some bad news. What you're looking at is a measure of how people perceive different religious groups in America. Here are Mormons. This is measured on a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 means that the person answering the question feels very cold toward the group. 100 means they feel very warm. 50 means they're right in the middle. You can see over here you've got Catholics and Jews. And actually here are African Americans. They're viewed pretty favorably. And I haven't put all the groups we've asked about here, but I have put Mormons next to atheists. And if I put Muslims, they'd be actually in between the atheists and the Mormons. So if you're a Mormon, you should be saying to yourself right now, thank God for the atheists. Because this is how Mormons are perceived. And this isn't going to come as a surprise to anyone in the audience. As a distinctive group that's been met with suspicion over their history, it's maybe not surprising to us that Mormons would be viewed negatively. But here's some evidence that internally Mormons do have this quasi-ethnic sense. Because we not only ask people how they perceive other religious groups, we also ask them how they perceive members of their own group. Here's Mormons. No group in America, whether religious, ethnic, or racial, loves themselves more than Mormons. Mormons love Mormons more than blacks love blacks, and Hispanics love Hispanics, and Jews love Jews, and Catholics love Catholics. And for no group do you find such a wide gap. The atheists come pretty close, actually. Atheists like atheists, too. In further evidence of this point, and this is not, I will say, the most rigorous social science, but it is, I think, a useful anecdote. Everyone in the room is aware of this new movie that's come out, Meet the Mormons, I assume. It's the Book of Mormon, the movie, kind of. So this movie, Meet the Mormons, has been made by the LDS Church, and it's in wide theatrical release. And you can go to Rotten Tomatoes. People know Rotten Tomatoes. This is a website that collects reviews on the one hand, published reviews of movies, but then also asks those from regular folk who have seen a movie to weigh in on what they think. I checked the Rotten Tomatoes rating of Meet the Mormons this morning. It has an 11% on the tomato meter, as they call it, among the critics. That's about as low as a movie gets frankly. Just to put that in context, there's a new movie out this weekend called Ouija. I'm going to bet this is not a crowd that's going to Ouija tonight, but there it is. Ouija has about the same rating as Meet the Mormons. But among those who have seen the movie, it has a 92%. 92%. That's up in Guardians of the Galaxy territory. It's basically the same story as what you see here. So as I said, Mormons as a group do have this sort of sense of ethnicness. And another way to put that is that Mormons truly are a peculiar people, and they're proud of it. In fact, we asked Mormons whether or not they accepted that description of themselves as a peculiar people, and 79% thought that that was an apt description. They were more than happy to be described as peculiar. One of the three authors of our book, John Green, is not LDS. He speaks Mormon, but he's not actually one of the tribe. And he was wary of our even asking this question. He said, surely people are going to be offended that we would suggest that they are peculiar. And we said, no, don't worry. Trust us. So I hope I've convinced you that Mormons are a distinctive group, bordering, as I said, on sort of an ethnic or quasi-ethnic type group. The word that's often used is Mormons are a people. They have a sense of peoplehood. Let me now turn and talk a little bit about the internal consequences of that distinctiveness. So I mentioned that Mormons have very tight social networks with other Mormons. Another way to say that is Mormons are tight-knit. And in being tight-knit, it means they form strong bonds with one another. They participate in voluntary activity together. They have a lot of what is often called social capital. And that social capital can be mobilized both for civic voluntarism, but also for political activity. Remember that 94% of self-identified Mormons say that the church is led by a prophet, which is pretty powerful motivation to play follow the leader, as famously articulated by Ezra Taft Benson before he was president of the church, but was basically the president in waiting, in a talk titled 14 Fundamentals in Following the Prophet. He specifically said that you should follow the prophet even when it comes to political matters. And that activity, that political activity, has most famously, or maybe infamously, depending on your view, has been on the political right, including opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, and more recently, opposition to same-sex marriage, particularly in California in 2008, as the LDS Church mobilized in favor of Proposition 8. Which, of course, wrote a ban on same-sex marriage into the Constitution of California, which has now been overturned by the Supreme Court. But Mormons will actually follow the prophet to the left as well as the right. Now, to some of you in the audience, that is going to seem like an utterly strange and alien proposition. Mormons moving to the political left rather than the political right by following the counsel of their religious leaders? But some in the audience may remember that it was not all that long ago that Mormons as a group actually split their votes between the two parties. And up to the mid-20th century, we actually found that Mormons were more likely to favor Democrats than they were to favor Republicans. Now, when we look at historical case studies, one example of where the Mormon leadership was able to nudge the opinion of Mormons to the political left rather than the political right is the MX missile back in the early 1980s. So for those who may not have in their living memory the issue of the MX missile, when the Reagan administration was just in its early days, there was this plan to put nuclear missiles in Utah that would be transported on basically railway tracks from silo to silo. So there would be more silos than there were missiles, and the idea was that the Soviets would never quite know where the missiles were. And Utah was selected as the site for the placement of these nuclear missiles, which of course would presumably mean that in the case of a nuclear attack, it would become the prime target. Well, Mormons, of course, went heavily for Reagan in 1980. And when the MX missile was first announced, their opinions were actually fairly split. And then they kind of shifted in favor of the MX missile. After all, this was an initiative of the Reagan administration. But then the first presidency of the LDS Church weighed in. And initially they did so somewhat elliptically. In fact, it's actually kind of amazing. The first statement that they made against the MX missile was actually in a Christmas message. And then in another one, it was in the Easter message from the first presidency. But these were not specific statements actually calling out the MX missile. Rather, they were statements about the evils of nuclear war and such. And it seemed like, if you looked at the polling, Mormons weren't getting the message. And so in May 1981, the first presidency of the LDS Church put out a statement that was very direct and specific, saying that the church opposed the placement of the MX missile here in Utah. And that one got Mormons' attention. Opposition to the missile rose to 67% here in Utah. Now, I know this is a skeptical bunch. And many of you are sitting there saying, well, Professor Campbell, maybe that's a test, but maybe it's not. On the other hand, there's a lot of self-interest wrapped up in that opposition to the missile. I mean, who wants to be the prime target of the Soviets at the height of the Cold War? So maybe we're not really testing whether or not Mormon leaders can move Mormon attitudes to the left, so much as we're just showing that Mormon leaders can remind church members of their own self-interest in the case of nuclear war. So my colleagues and I wanted to test whether or not it really was possible to move Mormons' attitudes to the political left when we told them, or perhaps reminded them, of positions that the church has taken, church leaders have taken, on issues that we would characterize with the left side of the spectrum rather than the right side of the spectrum. And two of those are immigration and a municipal statute, you might remember from a few years ago, here in Salt Lake City, that banned discrimination against gays and lesbians, which the church actually came out in favor of, to the surprise of many, because this came in the wake of Proposition 8 in California. Now, as I mentioned that non-discrimination statute, I'm reminded of a story that may or may not be true, but certainly has an element of truthiness to it, as Stephen Colbert might say. And try as we might, my co-authors and I, we just couldn't actually pin down where and when this happened, so we didn't include it in the book, but I'm comfortable sharing it with you today. The story goes that there was an elderly Latter-day Saint woman at church one Sunday. She's in a Sunday school or Relief Society lesson, something to that effect. And someone mentions the church's support for this anti-discrimination statute. And this woman, little hard of hearing, says, "What was that now?" And it's repeated to her. And she says, "No, wait a second. Are we for the gays now, or are we against the gays?" But like I said, we couldn't actually pin that one down, so it's not in the book. But so how did we test whether or not Mormon attitudes would move to the political left? Well, the way we did this was through an experiment. Now, when I say that, some of you might think that we're putting people in a lab and we have people with lightweight lab coats and we're injecting them with chemicals or something. Nothing like that at all. What we've done is, in a survey of Mormons, we take our group of Mormons and we randomly assign some to just be asked their opinion on immigration or this anti-discrimination statute. Others are randomly selected to hear a rather general statement taken from LDS leaders, so nothing that we do in these experiments is made up. Every word that people hear are actually from church leadership. So some, they get sort of a general statement, not unlike those first statements made about the MX missile. And then another group, they get a more specific statement attributed accurately to church leaders. And what do we find? Well, these are the attitudes on immigration and non-discrimination. These are the average levels of support for what we're calling the church's position among Mormons when they're not told anything about what the church has said. This is just what their opinion is. Here's what happens when we give them the general statement, and here's what happens when we give them the specific statement. On non-discrimination, there is a huge jump. On immigration, there's a roughly equal jump, whether it's a general statement or a specific one. And all of those effects are statistically significant, meaning they didn't just happen by chance. And what is even more amazing is the type of Mormon whose attitude is likely to shift toward the church's position, which, remember, in this case, would be in a liberal direction. The type of Mormon who is most likely to change his or her opinion are those who are also most likely to embrace LDS authority. That is, they're the ones who are most likely to say that we should follow the brethren, if you will, follow the leaders. And when I put it that way, that probably makes sense, right? The folks who say you should follow the leaders are the most likely to respond when they hear church leaders make these statements. But what is really quite remarkable about that is that those Mormons are also the most likely to be politically conservative. They're the hardcore Republicans. And so essentially what they're doing is putting their religion ahead of their party. And I can assure you, having spent a lot of time poring over a lot of data when it comes to other religious groups in the United States, that's not typically how it goes. Increasingly, Americans outside of Mormonism, they put their party, their politics, ahead of their religion. So to summarize the internal consequences of Mormons' distinctiveness, they truly do follow the prophet. Most of the time to the right, but at least occasionally to the political left. But I want you to keep that in mind, because I'm going to come back to that theme in a few minutes. But first I want to turn now to the external consequences of Mormons' distinctiveness. Again, there are some good news and some bad news associated with this point. For example, we've asked people about potential stereotypes they might hold of Mormons. And the bad news is that many Americans, so again, these are not surveys of Mormons, these are surveys of Americans in general, many Americans view Mormons as insular, which is actually a stereotype they often associate with Jews as well. They also believe that Mormons hold strange beliefs, and in that respect, they're actually much like Muslims. But at the same time, Americans in general don't view Mormons as particularly intolerant, disrespectful of women, or unable to think for themselves. We asked about those too. And the good news is that there are some positive stereotypes that come along with Mormons' distinctiveness. Mormons are viewed as having strong families, as are Catholics. They're viewed as being patriotic, as are both Catholics and Jews. They're viewed as being caring, again, like both Catholics and Jews. They're viewed as being friendly. And then, one of the stereotypes we asked about that I would characterize as ambiguous, Mormons are actually viewed as being rich, which for about half the country is a good thing, and for another half is maybe not a so good thing. Or maybe I might say for 47%, it's not such a good thing. There are other ways to tap into this good news, bad news about the way Mormons are perceived in the population. The Pew Research Center, they do an interesting kind of study where they'll ask people, what's the first word that pops into your head when we say, and they'll put something in the blank, when we say, in this case, Mormons? Well, again, when we ask this question, we have some good news and we have some bad news. The bad news is, when people are asked what one word best describes Mormons, the number one answer is cult. But the good news is, the number two and the number three answers are good or good people, or family values. So those are things that Mormons would probably say are a good thing. The good news, bad news story continues. The good news is that more Americans say they have a favorable than an unfavorable opinion of Mormons. The bad news is that Americans in general have a less favorable view of Mormons than almost every other religious group, as we saw earlier. The good news is that most Americans say that Mormons are Christians. It's about 70% of Americans say that. Of course, the bad news is that means 30% say that Mormons are not Christians. And if you're interested, 97% of Mormons themselves say that Mormons are Christians. And I've often wondered about that 3%. And maybe they didn't hear the question right, I'm not sure. All of which brings us to Mitt Romney, who perfectly reflects the good news, bad news story of Mormonism. I'm going to start with an example of how Romney clearly was thinking of the bad news side when he was first running for the presidency in 2007 and 2008. And to make this point, I'm going to show you a short clip of the famous speech that Mitt Romney gave in December 2007 to address his religion. This speech, of course, in many respects parallels a famous speech that John F. Kennedy gave in 1960 about his Catholicism. And what's interesting about Romney's speech is that about half of it is very much like Kennedy's speech, in which Romney speaks of the separation of church and state and says that he will not be influenced by leaders of his church. And that's essentially what Kennedy was saying. But then Romney, because he's running in a different political world than Kennedy, goes further. And he says, well, no authorities of my church are going to influence what I do. Don't worry, I won't be beholden to Salt Lake City. But you also need to know that I'm a true believer. I believe in Christ. In Mormon language, he bears his testimony. We're going to watch that in just a moment. But what's so interesting about what he does is that he's clearly carved out a space where he says, I'm just like most Americans in that I believe in Jesus, but it is not my place to get into what is distinctive, and that's the actual word that he uses, about my religion. So it's like he's willing to go to a point, but not beyond, in talking about his religion. Let's just see how that works.
There's one fundamental question about which I'm often asked. What do I believe about Jesus Christ? I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the Savior of mankind. My church's beliefs about Christ may not all be the same as those of other faiths. Each religion has its own unique doctrines and history. These are not bases for criticism, but rather a test of our tolerance. Religious tolerance would be a shallow principle indeed if it were reserved only for faiths with which we agree. There are some who would have a presidential candidate describe and explain his church's distinctive doctrines. To do so would enable the very religious test the founders prohibited in the Constitution. No candidate should become the spokesman for his faith, for if he becomes president, he will need the prayers of the people of all faiths.
So you can see how, as I put it in the title, Romney is demurring in talking about the distinctiveness of Mormonism. It's enough for you people to know that I believe in Jesus. Don't get into specifics about just what exactly I believe about Jesus. That's irrelevant. And of course, it didn't work very well, and I'll talk in a few moments about how Romney's Mormonism was perceived when he was first running for the presidency. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that Mormonism was entirely a negative for Romney. Because remember, there's some good news here too, right? There are some positive stereotypes that are also associated with Mormonism, and Romney was clearly aware of that. So I'm going to show you a second clip, one that did not get nearly as much attention as Romney's speech in 2007. The second clip comes from one of the presidential debates that Romney had against President Obama. This was the second of the debates. This was the one that was held with a town hall format. That is where regular folks stand up and ask questions of the candidates. And as you'll see, the questioner asks Romney and the president the sort of question that every political candidate wants. This is the pitch right over the plate that you can knock out of the park. It's essentially, tell us anything you want about yourself. Or as the questioner puts it, are there any misperceptions you want to clear up? Now, at no point does the questioner mention the 47% gaffe, but that's clearly what's in the air here. So this debate was held once that controversy, and if you remember, this was a speech that Romney had given in private to fundraisers in which he referred to the 47% who would never vote for him because they were freeloaders and such, and it became, of course, very controversial, and it kind of reinforced this image of Romney as an elitist. And so the Romney campaign was in damage control mode, trying to make people forget about the 47%. And what's so interesting about this response that Romney gives is that in order to rebut what became the most damaging charge leveled against him during the 2012 campaign is his religion. Watch.
Hi, Governor. I think this is a tough question. Each of you, what do you believe is the biggest misperception that the American people have about you as a man and a candidate? Using specific examples, can you take this opportunity to debunk that misperception and set us straight?
Thank you. And that's an opportunity for me, and I appreciate it. In the nature of a campaign, it seems that some campaigns are focused on attacking a person rather than prescribing their own future and the things they'd like to do. In the course of that, I think the president's campaign has tried to characterize me as someone who's very different than who I am. I care about 100% of the American people. I want 100% of the American people to have a bright and prosperous future. I care about our kids. I understand what it takes to make a bright and prosperous future for America again. I spent my life in the private sector, not in government. I'm a guy who wants to help with the experience I have, the American people. My passion probably flows from the fact that I believe in God, and I believe we're all children of the same God. I believe we have a responsibility to care for one another. I served as a missionary for my church. I served as a pastor in my congregation for about 10 years. I've sat across the table from people who were out of work and worked with them to try and find new work or to help them through tough times.
So there's Romney referencing that he was a missionary for his church and a pastor for his congregation for about 10 years. Now, to be technical, he wasn't a pastor, he was a bishop, and he was only a bishop for 5 and a stake president for 5, but close enough for government work. And isn't it interesting that he settles on his faith, which some viewed as the heaviest albatross on Romney's back, in order to rebut this charge that he didn't care about half of the country. I show you that clip again to reinforce the good news, bad news story. But let's turn to the data and ask, well, did Romney's Mormonism hurt him? Did it possibly help him? Or what effect did it have? Well, in 2008, it was very clear that Romney's Mormonism was damaging. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, this slide shows you the results of another one of these big experiments that we did. Again, scientifically drawn national sample. This was back in early 2008. Romney is still a viable candidate for the Republican nomination, but he's relatively unknown in the national scene. We take a group of people. We again randomly assign some to just hear some sort of boilerplate biographical information about Romney. We mentioned his kids and that he ran the Olympics, and then he'd been governor of Massachusetts, that sort of stuff. Then another group, they're told that Romney was a local leader in his church. We didn't tell them what church. And that actually didn't really have much effect. But then we also told another group that Romney was a local leader in the Mormon church. And what do we see? Well, whether you're a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat, all three of those groups had a negative reaction. The fact that these numbers are below 0 means that they were less likely, substantially less likely to vote for Romney upon hearing that he was a Mormon. And just to put that in perspective, this is how the charge that Romney was a Mormon compared to other information that people learned about other candidates running in 2008 and about their religious background. So here's how people reacted when they learned that Hillary Clinton was an active Methodist. Now, she's certainly a Methodist. Exactly how active she was, and we don't get any effect. That's essentially 0. And the reason for that is there's nobody on the planet Earth who hasn't already made up their mind about Hillary Clinton. Here's what happens when you tell people that Mike Huckabee is a Southern Baptist pastor. He is. He's an ordained minister in the Southern Baptist Convention. It's negative, but not nearly as much as what you find for Romney's Mormonism. Here's what happens when you tell people, and we were very careful in how we phrase this, we told people that there is a rumor that Barack Obama is actually a Muslim. This was in, again, 2008, so the whole machinery behind that claim had not really kicked into gear yet, and you can see that that's a pretty negative charge. And here's what happens when we tell people about Obama's controversial pastor. You might remember Jeremiah Wright, who quite famously had some pretty negative things to say about the United States in a clip that was played endlessly on cable news. That also led to a pretty negative reaction. So in other words, the negativity associated with Romney's Mormonism was right up there with the non-truth that Obama is a Muslim, or the charge that Obama attended this church that was hostile to America. This was a problem for Romney. But fast forward to 2012. Now, by this time, Romney has, of course, become much better known. The news media, frankly, weren't paying as much attention to his religion. He's in a general election race against Barack Obama, and there are, of course, many Americans, I'm told, perhaps even some in this very state, who would vote for anybody other than Barack Obama. And when we get to 2012, we did exactly the same experiment, and we see that for both Republicans and Democrats, and even independents, you really don't see much effect for reminding people that Romney is a Mormon. It's there as a slightly negative effect, but nothing like what you saw in 2008. And even more importantly, the specific charge that Mormons are not Christians ceases to be a concern by the time we get to 2012. We've done a bunch of other analysis, and I won't bore you with it, although if you want me to elaborate on it, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. But the bottom line is, Romney's Mormonism certainly mattered a lot to a few voters, but it mattered very little, or perhaps not at all, to most voters by the time we got to 2012. Romney took the same share of evangelical Christians as did George W. Bush, and actually won a substantially higher percentage of the evangelical vote than did John McCain in 2008. And that's the good news. Perhaps not good enough for Republicans who wanted to win the presidential election, but nonetheless good news, I would suggest, for anyone who actually cares about religious diversity and religious tolerance in America. And I would hope that's everyone, regardless of your partisan perspective. But this actually leads to another question. If Mormonism didn't really affect Mitt much, did Mitt affect Mormonism or perceptions of Mormonism? And amazingly, throughout this whole period, stemming back from 2006 up to January 2014, we see essentially no change in how people perceive Mormons. So this is, again, that 100-point scale that I showed you earlier. But now we're just showing it at different time points, starting in 2006, going up to 2014. So think of all that happened in that period. Not only did Mitt Romney run for the presidency twice, the Book of Mormon, the musical, takes off during this time. Big Love is on television. Sister Wives is on television. The I'm a Mormon campaign kicks up during this period. David Archuleta almost wins American Idol. Jimmer comes during this period. I mean, all sorts of stuff. What's going on, right? This is the Mormon moment. And it looks like nothing changes, which seems pretty remarkable. But if you scratch below the surface, there's actually a little more to the story. Because back in 2006, it didn't matter whether you were a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. Attitudes toward Mormons were about the same. Basically, everybody disliked Mormons equally. But you get to 2012, and importantly, not 2008. So this is not a Proposition 8 reaction. This is a Romney reaction. You see what I would call a partisan polarization in attitudes toward Mormons. Because now, Republicans have become warmer toward Mormons. Democrats have become colder. Independents have held steady, which is exactly what we would expect. And those trends all offset one another, which produce the flat line as an average, but nonetheless a pretty wide gap. And that gap persists even following the 2012 election. It wasn't just a fleeting Romney effect. We see it persist at least until January 2014. And if anyone in the room wants to write a check to give me a grant to do the study again, I'm more than happy to do that to fill in the rest of the chart. And in other experiments, when we ask not about Mitt Romney and his Mormonism, but give people a hypothetical candidate. We tell them about a congressional candidate or a mayor running in another place, and we describe that candidate in these glowing terms, and then some people hear that he's a Mormon. We also get a very strong partisan reaction. When Republicans hear that this candidate is a Mormon, they say, oh yeah, he's our guy. When Democrats hear that, they say, whoa, I'm not going to vote for that guy. And that's not necessarily bigotry. It might actually be a reasonable inference of where that candidate is going to land politically. That partisan reaction, however, as suggested here, is not limited only to political candidates. It is, of course, an extension of people's attitudes of Mormonism itself. And I would suggest that that is bad news. It's bad news for Latter-day Saints indeed. For the spiritual mission of the church will no doubt be harmed by the partisan inflection in attitudes toward Mormons. Just as today many evangelical Christians regret their entanglement with one party, so should Mormons. Prophetic voices will be more persuasive when they rise above the partisan fray. Few liberals, progressives, or even moderates will find the church the place for them. Whether these are potential converts who turn away from the church because, the church isn't that Republican organization, or current members who don't find themselves aligned politically with the majority within the church and with the party that the church is most commonly associated with, those current members are likely to drop out. And that's especially the case among the young, which is a trend we've also seen in other faiths, as young people turn away from religion that they see as too political. But I would suggest that even non-Mormons should care about this partisan polarization in attitudes toward Mormons, because it's bad news for the fabric of our religiously pluralistic society. A few years ago, I wrote a book that was mentioned in the introduction with Bob Putnam of Harvard, American Grace. And in that book, we argued that America was overall a religiously tolerant nation because precisely during the same period that religion was ripping us apart politically, Americans themselves were actually forging bonds across religious lines. Almost every American has a close friend or a family member who is of another faith. But if religious and political divisions should come to reinforce one another, those interreligious bonds will cease to counteract all of the negative consequences of the political polarization that we see among our elected officials. It will only exacerbate the polarization and have it extend into our families and in our neighborhoods and among our friends. However, let's go back to those internal consequences of Mormons' distinctiveness, the fact that Mormons will move to the left as well as to the right. Because the association of the church with political conservatism and the Republican Party is not set in stone. What might cause it to change? Well, one possibility would be more attention within the church to causes associated with the other side of the political spectrum, such as immigration or inequality. Imagine if we had a proclamation on caring for the stranger or caring for those who are in need. Or maybe if we had a Mormon Democrat run for president. President Reed, perhaps? Maybe not. Let me close with the thought that it is only when the church gets out of the partisan crossfire that Mormons will reach their promised land of full acceptance within the American religious mosaic. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. Do you want to call on people? Do you want to call on people? Okay, I'll follow the directions.
David Campbell would love to hear your questions, and we have microphones that will circulate in the crowd. We have the following request. Put up your hand if you have a question. We will bring a microphone to you. You will ask your question, and then you must give up your grip on the microphone after you have asked your question. Okay? Let me just repeat that one more time. Once you have asked the question, release your grip and return the microphone to one of my staff.
Fire away, folks.
To what extent would reaching the promised land require surrender of the peculiarness and the ethnicity and the tribalism that is also extant in Mormonism?
It's a very good question. It's the $64,000 question of how any group can, on the one hand, retain the kind of distinctiveness that feeds the internal vitality that keeps a religion going, but at the same time find acceptance. And frankly, as you look around America today and think about the history of various religious groups, we've seen maybe examples that the Mormons wouldn't want to follow. So there was once a time when Methodism was kind of what Mormons are today, right? They were the rabble-rousers, the radicals, and they were this highly vital faith. But then Methodism sort of lost that. Some have argued that the same pattern has followed for American Catholics. But I actually would point to American Judaism as an example where I think it is possible for a group to retain its distinctiveness without completely losing, first of all, the vitality within the faith, but also find broader acceptance. I think it's a matter of what elements of distinctiveness members of that group choose to emphasize. And in the case of Mormonism, we should remember that while it is a constant historically that Mormons have been distinctive or peculiar, just what exactly makes them peculiar, that has shifted over time. You know, there was once a time when alcohol and tobacco use was fairly common among Mormons. That kind of blows the minds of Mormons today. But today, that's something that sets Mormons apart. And so we have examples. That's maybe a more subtle one. There are a few other big examples like, polygamy. That is another case of where Mormons have moved away from their distinctiveness. But clearly over the language used in the church, clearly over the years, church leaders, they have been selective in picking their battles. Right? They pick some battles and not others. And I think it's a matter of which battles they pick and which points of distinction they choose to emphasize. Is that responsive, I hope?
Hi. Do you believe that the average American's dislike of Mormons leads to their powerful love of themselves, basically, like how you were saying before?
Yeah, the basic idea is if you're a minority under siege, you circle the wagons. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that actually. In fact, I do sometimes wonder, and I'm now moving beyond what I can say from the data, but this is just sort of based on my personal observation. I do sometimes wonder if there aren't at least some Mormons who do have a bit of a persecution complex. They sort of welcome the disregard from others because it reinforces exactly what you're saying. It reinforces their distinctiveness. And, from inside the faith, that may not be a totally bad thing, right? So teaching Mormon youth that they are going to stand apart, they're going to be different, that's probably a message that resonates with a lot of people. Again, it comes back to exactly how it is you're going to be set apart from others. Is it going to be a message of what we are or a message of what we are not?
I may have missed something here, but you're at Notre Dame and you're a professor there. What is your contact with the Mormons?
Well, I went to BYU.
Are you LDS? No, I would assume.
This always comes out. I'm always outed. Yes, I am. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and somehow I ended up at Notre Dame.
So you are, okay.
But it's funny. I'm always a fish out of water. So I'm not even an American. I was born and raised in Canada, and I teach American politics. And I've written a book about Mormons, and I'm at a Catholic university. It's like I just can't quite get my story straight. I gave a presentation once at Notre Dame, and the topic was on Catholics and American politics, and I started out by observing that I am neither an American nor a Catholic, but if you want to hear what a non-American, non-Catholic has to say about Catholics and American politics, stick around, and I thought it was hilarious. But apparently, not everyone in the audience got the joke, because the next day, the front page of the campus newspaper at Notre Dame had a story about this presentation that I'd given, and the first sentence of the story was, "Yesterday, Professor David Campbell, neither a Catholic nor an American, said, ... So the way the authorship of our book went, there are three of us who are authors of this book, and one of us is a Mormon not at BYU, that's me. Another is a Mormon at BYU, that's Quinn Monson. Another is John Green, he's the non-Mormon not at BYU. We wanted to get a non-Mormon at BYU, but it turns out not a lot of those to choose from. So. Was there more that you wanted to ask me, or is that? When you brought up LDS, I was, yes. I did? Do I pass the test? I'm one of the tribe.
Hi, my name is Tatiana, and I'm from Miami, Florida, and there isn't a really good perception about Mormons. I'm not a Mormon. I don't think I'll ever be a Mormon. But I wanted you to talk about the Mountain Meadow Massacre and why the church doesn't talk about it.
Well, to be fair, in recent years the church actually has talked more about it. There was a very important book published recently by Oxford University Press, so serious academic press, that was on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It drew on material from church archives. I believe we have one of the authors of the book here, actually. I think it's fair to say that's the definitive book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And, it was published by people working for the church with full access to the church archives. Now, with that said, I think it's clear that whether it's the Mountain Meadows Massacre or other aspects of Mormon history, the church has not always been as forthcoming about what some might consider to be those nettlesome aspects of Mormon history as perhaps they could be. But it appears as though we are in a new era. The church has been publishing these essays on the church's website about issues that in the past were just completely swept under the rug. I mean, we've now had 2 essays on polygamy and 1 on blacks in the priesthood. I mean, these are, to younger folks, you may not recognize just how significant it is. I mean, there were people who were excommunicated from the church decades ago for basically saying the same things that appear in these essays today. So I think there is an opening up. I suspect that the Mormon moment, of which the Mitt Romney candidacy was an important part, is related to that opening up, that I think there's a recognition that maybe the church should be better off by being a little more open. I think there's also a great concern among church leaders about church members who would go online, say, or just through other sources, find out things about church history that they had not learned at church, and it is problematic for them. And so the church has sort of thought, well, maybe it's better to inoculate people and lay it all out, whether it's the Mountain Meadows Massacre or the rather tortured history the church has had with race or those sorts of things.
I have a quick question for you about gender. Sorry, right over here.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am. Yes, and from thinking about what you were talking about the Brethren statements, Mitt Romney, Stephen R. Covey, I'm kind of sensing a male flavor here. And I wondered if you could gender nuance any of the data that you've presented tonight. Is there any sort of uniquely female, feminist, or feminine aspect to this topic?
I'm glad you asked that question, because there is, but it's subtle. So if you just look at the overall picture of LDS women and how they view the role of women in the church, pretty high percentages say they're perfectly comfortable with the role of women in the church. We ask questions like, we didn't actually ask so direct a question as, do you think women should hold the priesthood? Partly because we had to get this through the Human Subjects Committee at BYU, so that wasn't going to go over so well. But also because I think for many Mormons that question is essentially, do you believe in the church? So we ask more subtle questions. We ask questions like, do you think women should have more voice in the church? Which is actually consistent with some things that church leaders have said, right? Women should be more involved in church ward councils and that sort of thing. And then we ask a question, agree or disagree. I sometimes feel uncomfortable with the role of women in the church. And what you find are small but significant differences in how women and men answer those questions. So most Mormon women say they're comfortable with the role of women in the church, but there's this sliver, this fraction who say they're not. And that group is very distinctive because they also would take what I might describe as a feminine or at least a different perspective on questions like the role of church authority, for example. So these are folks who are a little less likely to automatically embrace the authoritative statements from church leaders. And the reason why, to me, this is so significant is with the change in the rules regarding missionary service and when women can serve, and they can serve now at a younger age, and therefore we've seen this dramatic increase in the number of women serving missions. I think that's going to have a huge effect on the church, because I think that perspective that I just described, that is now going to be found in more and more women who have gone and served missions and have that credential, right? They have the bona fides. I've served a mission. And they will have gone out into the mission field, and they will have served in positions of leadership in a way that we've just never seen before. So I think that while all the attention today has been on ordained women and the Kate Kelly case, I think the real story, the long-term effect that we're going to see in the church is actually all these missionaries who are going out and coming back. And so 20 years from now, I think we're going to see a very different LDS church in the way it views the role of women. I don't know whether it'll be as dramatic a change as women getting the priesthood or anything like that, but I do think that you will see a change in how that voice from women is expressed, and that in turn I think will have an effect on how the internal deliberations happen at the ward level and at the stake level.
So in your talk, you mentioned mid-20th century there was a propensity to Mormons identify as Democrat, and then that's a switch. You didn't really identify the causes, so I'm curious to what extent it's principled causes versus just kind of happenstance of leaders. In the early 20th century, you have prominent Democrats like Anthony Ivins, B.H. Roberts, Heber J. Grant prior to the New Deal. They get replaced by J. Reuben Clark, Ezra Taft Benson, who are prominent Republicans. To what extent is it principal shifts of the church with politics versus just kind of happenstance of leadership and personality?
Well, I think there are two moving parts here. One is what's happening inside the church. So what we don't see is a sharp break where Mormons once were Democrats and now they're Republicans. It'd be a clean story if we could say, well, it was all Reagan. Once Reagan ran and all Mormons loved Reagan, then they all became Republicans. We actually don't see that. What we see is a subtle, gradual shift. Beginning in roughly the mid-1950s, Mormons begin to drift toward the Republican Party. And part of that is because within the church itself, to the extent that politics is being discussed, it's being discussed on the right. So in the 50s, we've got the Red Scare, anti-communism, and then we've got concerns being raised about the welfare state and that sort of thing. But just as importantly, we have changes going on outside of the church in the parties. Because part of that story of Mormons moving toward the Republicans is not just a Mormon story. It's actually a story of the rise of what's sometimes called the God gap, generally speaking, whereas people who are more religious are more likely to favor the Republican Party. That happened because the parties themselves began to separate on social issues, issues that divide religious and secular Americans. It is remarkable to me that in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for the presidency as a Catholic, and that was a huge issue, his Catholicism, at no point in that campaign was he ever asked about abortion. Not because he was hiding it, not because people didn't want to get into it. It's because it just wasn't on the agenda. It just wasn't an issue. It didn't become an issue until really the mid-1970s. And once it did become an issue, and then it was followed by debates over the role of women and now debates over gay rights, once the parties began to differentiate themselves on those issues, you began to see highly religious folks move over to the Republican side, Mormons being the most... Actually, the way to put it is it's white religious folks who gravitated toward the Republican Party. There is no group in America that is more religious than Mormons, and frankly, no group that is whiter than Mormons. And so those two factors together. So you've got stuff going on in the church and stuff going on with the parties, and those two things together have created the Republican dominance within the party, or within the church today.
Yes. In your interview this morning with Doug Fabrizio, you mentioned the fact that young Mormons, as compared to older Mormons, are becoming more conservative.
Yes.
So I would like you to please address, is this more conservative on social issues or on more like political, economic issues? And why do you account for that when in general it appears that younger people in general are becoming more liberal in America, and what that might portend?
Well, to be a little more specific, this is you were wondering whether I really am a political scientist, but now I'm going to put on my political science cap. What we find is that young Mormons are more likely to be Republican, which is a little different than saying they're conservative. Right? They're more likely to be Republican than are old Mormons. Now that's remarkable because it's exactly the reverse in the rest of the population, just as you were saying. Right? That generally speaking, young people, they lean Democratic, and it's the old folks who are voting Republican. So young people turn out for presidential elections, and Obama wins. Old people turn out for midterm elections, and the Republicans win. But with Mormons, it's reversed. Now, one reason for that is those old Mormons, they came of political age at a time, and this is when people adopt their partisan affiliation, and it usually sticks with them over their lifespan. They came of political age at a time when Mormons split their votes. It didn't seem like such an incongruous thing to be a Mormon and a Democrat. Right? They could look to Hugh B. Brown, and they could look to Jim Faust, and people like this among church leaders and say, well, I can be a Democrat and be a Mormon. But over time, because of these trends that I was describing earlier, young people today, coming of political age, they just can't seem to connect their Mormonism and the Democratic Party. Now, there's a big footnote, a big asterisk to this, which is to say that young Mormons are more likely to be Republican than their parents or their grandparents doesn't actually mean that they're more likely to be conservative across the board. So we do find that young Mormons are actually, just to take one example, a little more likely than their parents and grandparents to support either gay marriage or more commonly civil unions, a legal recognition of same-sex relationships that maybe is not quite to the extent of marriage. Now, young Mormons are still way more conservative on that issue than their peers. Trust me, at Notre Dame, same-sex marriage is not even an issue among my students. Nobody opposes it. Among young Mormons, it's still a matter of debate. but it's still pretty remarkable that they're different than their parents and their grandparents. Does that make sense? There's a hand here.
Well, you can hear me, I think. My first thought, as you were going through the fact that there has been...
Go ahead and use the mic, then everyone can hear you.
Since there has not been much change between 2006 and to the current time, in the outside perception of the Mormon Church, my first thought was, boy, the LDS Church has spent millions of dollars to try and improve that image to outside people. Have you talked to the PR department? Because it makes it look like maybe that money hasn't been spent as wisely as they were hoping.
Maybe there's some in the audience today, I don't know. What they need is a high-priced consultant from a prominent Catholic university. That's what they need. What I would say, and I actually have said this to folks in public affairs, and certainly I've said it publicly, and I do believe it. It's more than an article of faith. It's based on data, which is perceptions of Mormons, or actually any religious group, are not driven by what people see in the media. It's driven by personal relationships. And the more people have not acquaintances, but close friends or family members who are Mormons, that's where we see those barriers break down. And we have all sorts of evidence of that. And so for every I'm a Mormon campaign and every Meet the Mormons type movie that's made, those probably don't hurt. But what will really turn the dial, if you will, is when Mormons themselves as a group reach out and become less insular and form, again, meaningful relationships with those who are not necessarily members of the tribe. That's a hard thing for Mormons to do. They're busy people, right? They got lots of stuff to do. But that's the reality. Over here?
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the point you made before the question and answer session about in order to not be identified with one political party that the Mormon Church would need to get out of the crossfire of politics. So I was wondering, as far as your vision for that, would you see that as more of a doubling down on political engagement across the spectrum to reach all sorts of voters or different political affiliations, or would you see that as more of a disengagement and then allow that for people to decide on their own?
Well, the first thing we should note, and this is important to remind ourselves, which is that LDS leaders are actually rarely involved in politics. That's why when they do get involved, it's so effective, because it's rare. It gets people's attention. Trust me, go attend an Episcopal church. Go attend a synagogue. You'll hear political appeals all the time, and they don't do much good because they come all the time. Kind of like, every time your elders quorum president whines about home teaching, it just goes over the heads of the people in the audience, right? But when they come out and say, the brethren want us to support this ballot initiative, whoa, when does that happen? That's once in a lifetime, right? And it's also true that there have been statements made by church leaders, most famously by Elder Marlon Jensen, that have explicitly said, we need more Democrats in the church. I do not, however, think that the church's purposes would be well served by getting more involved in partisan politics. I think that's only likely to turn people off on both sides of the aisle. We see that actually in other religious groups. What I'm saying is there are already themes and messages within Mormonism that lie all across the political spectrum, that actually have no particular partisan content even. And if those messages are emphasized to a greater extent than they have been, it is not inconceivable that you would see Mormon opinion maybe be not so monolithically on one side of the spectrum. I gave you the example of immigration. I think that's probably the most prominent one. Some Mormons will have their minds blown to know that Dieter Uchtdorf had a meeting with President Obama and came out and held a press conference in which he said, this is a guy we can do business with. Now, of course, he's German, so some people are saying, well, he hasn't quite understood the way things work in America. But you get the point that I'm saying. So again, imagine if the church put as much emphasis on caring for the immigrant, or in this recent talk that Elder Holland has given a general conference on caring for the poor. Imagine if that were emphasized more. What if we had youth conferences on that theme, and what if we had our little kids in primary marching around singing songs about it? Well, things might change. Sure, whatever. I got nowhere to go. I'm here for the weekend, so. But I don't want to pick, so I'm going to let the the microphone
I actually have a
people.
question. And I would stand, but I'm pretty sure I would block your camera, which would make it a lot less fun for you to watch it later. But my question, so a lot of your data comes from kind of survey data that you've collected from Mormons.
Yep.
So I'm just curious if the majority of people that you surveyed were from Utah, or if they were from other places around the United States. And, you know, if they were primarily from Utah, if you think that would make a difference in the strength of your data.
Well, these are national samples. Okay, so what we find in our surveys is exactly the composition of Mormons, whether it's where they're geographically concentrated or what their income level is or what their race is. What we find in our survey is what you would find in the overall population. So yes, there are a lot of Utah residents in our survey, but we didn't target them specifically. And you know, these days you actually do find a fair percentage of the church population outside of Utah. Now, because there's so much talk in the church of Utah Mormons versus non-Utah Mormons, we actually do that. We run some tests. And it turns out actually Utah Mormons and non-Utah Mormons, they differ a lot less than you might think, which came as a bit of a surprise to us. There are some differences, and the biggest one is actually on this insularity that I was talking about. Utah Mormons are much more likely to be, if you will, insular sounds so pejorative. They're so much more likely to score high on homophily and endogamy. I didn't want the Tanner Center to think that they just invited some rube from the sticks here. I got to throw out some $5 words and convince you I really have a PhD. So are we down? We're to the final question?
Well, this is a follow-up on that one, really, because I thought I heard you say that in your survey you just asked people if they self-identified as Mormon. Well, I'm wondering if within that you had any way to distinguish between active and inactive, and if you had any way to see whether the results were different depending on what kind of activity they thought they had.
I'm glad you asked that question. It's kind of a complicated answer, but stick with me. Okay. So the way these surveys work is in order for you to receive our survey, you have to self-identify as a Mormon. That means if someone calls you up and says, "Hi, I'm from the Pew Research Center, I'd like to do a survey with you. What is your religious affiliation?" You would then say, "Well, I'm a Latter-day Saint," or "I'm Mormon." Or in some of the other surveys we do, they're online, and so you check a box. Okay. By simply checking that box or telling that person on the phone, "Yeah, I'm a Mormon," you are already indicating that you are in the tribe. So we know we are not surveying those people who are so disaffected from the church that they no longer identify that way, even though they may appear on the rolls of the church. I suspect that many in the audience are aware that there are a few people out there whose names appear on those rolls who don't actually darken the doors of the church. My favorite example of this is, did you know that Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, is actually Mormon? When he was 10 years old, he was baptized a Mormon. His family was active in the church for about a year, and they moved on. So today his official biography lists him as something else, not Mormon. But somewhere in Salt Lake City, in the church headquarters, there is a computer file that has his name on it, but he probably wouldn't appear in our survey. Okay. So that's the first thing to note. So when we get these kind of high measures of Mormon religious activity, it's people who are in the tribe. Now, we ask them how active they are. We actually use that question, how active are you? It turns out to be a really useful way because Mormons know that language, but we ask them other stuff. Do you hold the temple recommend? Do you hold a calling? Do you pay tithing? And all that kind of stuff, right? But we can actually do a little bit better than just rely on this self-identification because we have another source of data. It's a massive study that was done of tens of thousands of Americans, so much, much larger than we normally have. And in that study, we can actually identify people who were raised Mormon, but no longer identify as Mormon. Now, we can do that for Catholics, and we can do it for Baptists, and we can do it for any group as well. But we'll call them ex-Mormons. The ex-Mormons are fascinating because unlike the ex-Catholics and the ex-Baptists, these folks are not lukewarm toward religion. So the ex-Catholics, did you know that actually this is true? Ex-Catholics are the 4th largest religious group in America today. That's true. That is, honest to goodness, true. But these are folks who, they still might attend religious services now and again. They still might believe in God. They sort of have some measures of religiosity. Ex-Mormons, they are the most secular group you can imagine, which suggests to me that Mormonism is very binary. Either you're in or you're out. And just to sort of tie this all together, my fear is that if the LDS Church is all wrapped up in this partisan perspective, you're likely to see more and more people turn that switch off, and they're all going to be of a particular type. They're going to be those who are uncomfortable with the politics that they hear at church. And the reason I'm confident in saying that is that's exactly what we've seen in the rest of the population. The most stunning change on the American religious landscape over the last 25 years has been the increase in the percentage of Americans who say they have no religion. 25 years ago, 5% of the population said they had no religion. Today, 20%, and it's climbing. Of Americans under 30, it's 35%. And why is that? All the evidence points in one direction. These are folks who do not like the fact that in contemporary America, religion, rightly or wrongly, is tangled up with partisan politics. Because these are folks who don't like that politics, and therefore they don't want to be a part of religion. So on that sobering note, happy Halloween. Good to have you all here.